A blonde mechanic, mocked for her tattoo, is arrested on a military base. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's training yard as Jane Kessler knelt on the asphalt, her grease-stained coveralls drawing sneers from the soldiers circling her. "Look at that pathetic ink," one corporal spat, pointing at the faded eagle clutching a dagger that peeked from beneath her rolled sleeve. Probably got it drunk at some strip mall parlor. Military police yanked her arms behind her back, metal cuffs biting into her wrists as base security sirens wailed overhead. The charge was treason, they said, her movements flagged as suspicious by advanced surveillance systems that tracked her every step through the maintenance hangars. Colonel Marcus Reed stood at the edge of the crowd, his marine dress jacket buttoned tight despite the Carolina heat, watching the scene unfold with an expression carved from stone. Something flickered behind his eyes when Jane's sleeve rode up, exposing more of that crude tattoo, but he remained silent as they hauled her to her feet. The question burning through the hostile air wasn't just why a simple mechanic had triggered such an aggressive response, but what secrets lay buried beneath years of engine grease and anonymity. If her true identity stayed hidden, she faced decades in military prison, or worse, but revealing it might unravel a conspiracy that reached into the darkest corners of American intelligence. Jane Kessler's life at Fort Bragg followed a rhythm as predictable as the reveille that echoed across base each dawn. She arrived at the maintenance bay by 0600 hours, sliding beneath Humvees and transport trucks with the practiced ease of someone who found comfort in mechanical problems that had clear solutions. Her small apartment 3 miles off base contained nothing but the essentials: a single bed with military corners, a kitchenette stocked with protein bars and instant coffee, and a bathroom where she scrubbed engine oil from beneath her fingernails each night. The only hint of something more lay beneath loose floorboards near her bed, where a steel lockbox waited like a sleeping ghost from another life. The maintenance bay hummed with constant activity, a cathedral of steel and diesel where Jane moved like a shadow among louder, younger mechanics who swapped stories about weekend conquests and deployment rumors. She ate alone at the mess hall's corner table, eyes scanning exits while she methodically consumed whatever gray meat and overcooked vegetables filled her tray. Her colleagues learned quickly that Jane Kessler didn't participate in after-work beers or Friday poker games, preferring to disappear into the civilian gym downtown where she trained in Krav Maga until sweat soaked through her nondescript gray sweats. Ever spotted a symbol that felt off? Comment below. The tattoo caused problems from her first day at Fort Bragg 2 years ago. She'd learned to keep her sleeves rolled down despite the suffocating heat, but sometimes during particularly stubborn repair jobs, the fabric would slide up, revealing the faded eagle and dagger that made other mechanics pause and whisper. The design looked amateur at first glance, like something scratched by a shaky hand in poor light. But those who stared longer noticed details that didn't belong on barracks flash art. The specific angle of the dagger, the number of feathers in the eagle's wings, the barely visible letters hidden in the shading. Major Trent Carver made a habit of visiting the maintenance bays, his crisp uniform and easy smile marking him as one of those officers who hadn't forgotten where they came from. He'd lean against tool benches, sharing stories about his time in logistics, asking mechanics about their families and weekend plans with what seemed like genuine interest. Jane noticed how his questions always circled back to security protocols, maintenance schedules, and which vehicles left base for extended periods. She kept her responses minimal, professional, but Carver's gaze lingered on her longer than the others, something calculating behind his affable demeanor. The note appeared on a Tuesday night, slipped beneath her apartment door while she showered off the day's grime. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the single line written in block letters. "Eagle's claw never forgets." The paper burst into flames the moment she finished reading, a trick she hadn't seen in 5 years. Someone knew who she was, what she'd been, and they wanted her to know they were watching. Jane spent that night sitting in darkness, back against the wall, a wrench gripped in her hand like the weapons she'd sworn never to touch again. Fort Bragg's massive sprawl offered perfect cover for someone wanting to disappear into military routine. 67,000 personnel moved through its gates daily, creating a river of faces where one quiet mechanic could vanish among the current. She'd chosen this base specifically because Reed commanded a battalion here, close enough to reach if everything went wrong but distant enough to maintain her cover. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her, hiding from her past in the shadow of the man who'd shaped it, fixing vehicles for an institution that had made her into something she'd spent years trying to forget. The flashbacks came at night, triggered by diesel fumes or the distant thump of helicopter rotors that sent her back to places with names scrubbed from official records. Jane hadn't always been a mechanic with calloused hands and downcast eyes. She'd been Eagle, one of 12 operatives in a unit that didn't exist on any Pentagon flowchart. Claw operated in the spaces between legal and necessary, conducting operations that would never appear in history books but kept American interests secure through methods no politician would publicly endorse. The tattoo had been earned in Kandahar after a mission that should have killed her, when she'd held a position alone for 17 hours, while her team extracted an asset whose intelligence prevented a biological attack on 3 major cities. Colonel Marcus Reed had recruited her straight from Delta Force selection, recognizing something in the 24-year-old soldier that went beyond physical capability. Under his command, she'd learned to speak 7 languages, forge documents that fooled intelligence services, and eliminate targets with everything from sniper rifles to poisoned wine glasses. Her unit became family in ways civilians could never understand. Viper, whose fingers could break any encryption faster than government supercomputers. Ghost, who could put a bullet through a playing card at 1,500 meters. Hammer, who taught her 63 ways to kill with bare hands while discussing his daughter's ballet recitals. Ever had a past you couldn't escape? Share your story in the comments. The Syria operation changed everything in one blood-soaked night that left half of Claw dead or missing. Someone had leaked their position to hostile forces, turning a routine extraction into an ambush that played out like a nightmare choreographed by professionals who knew exactly how Claw operated. Jane escaped through a sewer system with 2 bullets in her shoulder and Ghost's blood under her fingernails, emerging 3 days later to find her unit disbanded and her name on a termination list that didn't mean retirement. She'd faked her death in a car accident outside Damascus, using skills Claw had taught her to vanish so completely that even her former handlers believed the charred corpse belonged to their best operative. Fort Bragg offered anonymity through its sheer size, but choosing Reed's base had been calculated risk wrapped in desperate hope. She'd tracked his career through public records, watching him rise through ranks while keeping his own Claw past buried beneath exemplary service records. Their paths never crossed directly, but she'd catch glimpses of him during ceremonies, noting how his left hand still moved to check for weapons that weren't there, how his eyes swept rooms with the same tactical assessment she couldn't stop making. If the worst happened, if her cover shattered, Reed would understand why she'd done what she'd done, even if duty forced him to bring her in. The base martial arts tournament was voluntary, but Jane's supervisor insisted she participate to build team cohesion with mechanics who already whispered about her antisocial tendencies. She'd planned to lose in the first round, take a dive that would reinforce her image as a middle-aged woman past her prime. The plan collapsed when her opponent, a cocky private half her age, grabbed her shirt during a grapple, tearing the fabric to expose the full tattoo across her shoulder blade. Time slowed as his eyes widened, recognizing something in the design that his combatives instructor had shown during a classified briefing on historical special operations units. Major Carver's voice cut through the crowd's murmur, like a blade finding ribs. Well, looks like our mechanic has some interesting body art. He pushed through the circle of spectators, that practiced smile sharp as broken glass. That's quite specific iconography, Miss Kessler. The kind of ink that tells stories about places decent people don't go and things patriots don't do. His words dripped with knowledge that went beyond casual observation. each syllable calculated to prod wounds that hadn't healed. Almost looks like a traitor's mark, doesn't it? The kind worn by people who sold out their country for 30 pieces of silver. The crowd's energy shifted from curious to hostile as Carver's accusations found fertile ground in young soldiers trained to despise betrayal above all sins. Jane felt her body dropping into a combat stance before conscious thought engaged, muscle memory overriding 5 years of practiced submission. She forced herself to relax, to play the confused civilian, but the damage was done. In the back of the crowd, a face she hadn't seen since Syria watched with an expression that could have meant anything. Viper, older but unmistakable, wearing contractor credentials and a 1,000-yard stare that matched her own. The hangar where Reed confronted her smelled of aviation fuel and old secrets, its vast space empty except for a mothballed Black Hawk that had seen better days. Jane heard him coming before he spoke, recognizing the slight drag in his left foot from a wound earned in Mogadishu before either of them knew units like Claw existed. "Eagle, you can't hide forever." His voice cracked with the weight of memories neither could afford to carry. The words summoned ghosts of burning villages and successful missions that felt like failures, of young operators who'd trusted him with their lives only to vanish into classified files. Jane's eyes burned with tears she hadn't shed since Syria, her carefully maintained armor cracking as the colonel who'd been more father than commander stood before her with his own pain carved into every line of his face. "What would you do if your past came knocking? Drop your thoughts below." Reed's fingers moved to his jacket buttons with ceremonial precision, revealing what Jane had suspected but never confirmed. An identical tattoo etched across his chest, the eagle's eyes seeming to track movement like the living predator it represented. The gathered officers, drawn by Carver's accusations and the promise of scandal, gasped at the revelation that their decorated colonel bore the same mark as the suspected traitor. "Every member of Claw earned this," Reed said, his voice carrying across the hangar with parade ground authority. "Through operations that kept this country safe, while men like Major Carver slept peacefully in their beds, never knowing how close death came to their doorsteps." Jane's tactical instincts screamed warnings as she catalogued the reactions around her. 3 lieutenants exchanged glances that spoke of prior knowledge, their hands drifting towards sidearms and movements too practiced for regular infantry. A female captain she'd seen in intelligence briefings stood near the exit, fingers flying across a encrypted phone with urgency that suggested wheels already in motion. But it was Carver's expression that confirmed her worst fears. Satisfaction mixed with something deeper, a personal vendetta wearing the mask of professional duty. The encrypted messages she'd glimpsed on supposedly secure maintenance computers suddenly made sense, their references to Claw cleanup, not historical housekeeping, but active hunting operations. "Someone's killing us," Reed continued, producing a tablet showing faces Jane recognized, despite years of separation. Ghost's corpse in a Bangkok alley, 3 bullets in a pattern she'd seen before. Hammer dead in his Michigan home, his daughter's ballet shoes still in his hand. Python, the unit's medic, burned alive in a Mexico City safe house that shouldn't have been findable. 7 confirmed dead in 6 months, all looking like accidents or random violence until you piece together the pattern. Someone with resources, intelligence access, and a very specific grudge is hunting down every surviving member of Claw. The paranoia Jane had fought for 5 years crystallized into tactical assessment as her mind processed available data. Viper's presence suggested either alliance or betrayal, his contractor status providing perfect cover for movement across military installations. The base's security systems had flagged her movements, but who had programmed them to recognize behavioral patterns she'd thought unique to Claw training? Reed's revelation felt simultaneously like salvation and trap, exposing her to enemies while offering resources she desperately needed. Trust, that luxury she'd abandoned in a Damascus sewer, beckoned like a loaded weapon with the safety off. Reed handed her a photograph that made her blood freeze. The Kabul safe house, where she'd spent 3 months recovering from the Kandahar mission, its walls decorated with photos of claw operators someone had been collecting for years. The image was dated last week, taken by a CIA asset who'd died 12 hours after transmitting it. Someone wasn't just hunting claw. They were excavating its history with archaeological precision, piecing together operations that had been compartmentalized beyond even congressional oversight. The kind of investigation that required access to systems Viper had spent years learning to penetrate. Her apartment window exploded in spiderwebs of fractured glass as a sniper's laser painted her forehead for one heartbeat before vanishing. Jane rolled behind the Blackhawk's landing gear, muscle memory overriding civilian reflexes as her mind calculated angles and distances. The shot never came, suggesting warning rather than assassination, but the message was clear. They could touch her whenever they chose. Reed's hand found her shoulder, steady and familiar, as sirens began wailing across base. "Welcome back to the war, Eagle," he said quietly. "This time, we know it's coming." The secure bunker beneath Fort Bragg's administrative complex hadn't appeared on any schematic Jane had studied, its existence known only to officers with clearances that transcended standard military hierarchy. Reed's keycard opened blast doors that could withstand direct missile strikes, revealing a command center where forgotten wars were planned and denied. "Claw wasn't abandoned," Reed said, his voice thick with disgust as screens flickered to life showing casualty reports. "We were sold. Every operation, every asset we developed, every method we perfected got packaged and auctioned to the highest bidder by people who saw us as disposable tools in their private games. The government that had created them had also marked them for deletion, their knowledge too dangerous for retirement, their skills too valuable to leave unmonitored. Could you face a hidden enemy? Comment with your gut instinct." The dossier on the broker read like a nightmare wrapped in financial documents. Not a name, but a position, occupied by someone who'd turned information into currency and death into commodity. The figure had orchestrated 17 assassinations in the past decade, all targeting intelligence assets who'd disrupted operations worth billions in arms deals, drug routes, and human trafficking networks. Claw had unknowingly cost him a fortune during an operation in Prague, exposing shell companies that funneled weapons to 3 different terrorist organizations. Now he was collecting payment in blood, using resources that suggested connections reaching into the heart of American intelligence. Every dead operator represented not just revenge, but elimination of witnesses who could expose the rot festering in classified programs. Jane's hands moved without conscious thought, field stripping a Glock while her mind processed tactical options. 5 years of hiding had dulled edges that needed to be razor sharp, but muscle memory ran deeper than rust. She assembled the weapon in 12 seconds, a full second slower than her claw standard, then repeated the process until her fingers remembered their old speed. The maintenance bay's tools transformed in her hands. Wrenches became close-quarter weapons. Diagnostic computers yielded their secrets to skills Viper had taught her during long nights in Belgrade safe houses. She mapped 17 escape routes through Fort Bragg's perimeter, calculated response times for military police, identified which vehicles could withstand small arms fire. Carver's role crystallized when Reed revealed the second file, this one marked with personal effects tags from an operation Jane remembered too well. "His brother was Dr. Marcus Carver," Reed said quietly. "Biological weapons researcher we extracted from Iran in 2014. Except the intelligence was poisoned, and the good doctor was actually developing nerve agents for sale to anyone with 8 figures to spend." Jane's memory supplied the rest. The laboratory explosion that had killed the target and 2 claw operators when they discovered his true allegiance. Carver's mockery hadn't been random cruelty, but calculated revenge. 5 years of investigation leading him to the mechanic whose report had signed his brother's death warrant. The tracker in her toolbox was Russian manufacture, military grade, broadcasting her location to receivers that could be anywhere within a 1,000-mile radius. Jane's hands shook as the full weight of violation crashed over her. Every private moment, every careful routine, every night she'd sat in supposed solitude had been observed, catalogued, analyzed. Her breathing hitched as rage and humiliation warred in her chest, the careful walls she'd built crumbling under the knowledge that her hiding had been an illusion. They'd watched her shower, sleep, train in secret, pretending to be invisible while they documented every movement like a specimen under glass. The second device made it worse. A microscopic audio transmitter in her smoke detector, meaning they'd heard every nightmare, every whispered name of dead teammates, every moment of weakness she'd allowed herself in the dark. Another revelation shattered assumptions. When Reed accessed files showing Claw hadn't been unique, 13 similar units had operated under different designations, all conducting operations that blurred legal lines until they snapped. Each unit had been disbanded after members started dying in statistically impossible accidents, their handlers vanishing into retirement or early graves. The pattern stretched back 3 decades, a cycle of creation, exploitation, and elimination that suggested Claw's hunters weren't rogue elements, but part of an established protocol. They weren't being murdered. They were being decommissioned, like obsolete equipment that knew too many secrets. Viper's appearance in the bunker came through channels that should have been impossible to penetrate, his contractor credentials somehow clearing checkpoints Reed hadn't authorized. "The broker's moving tonight," he said without preamble, producing satellite imagery showing a compound in Virginia where 2 more Claw operators were being held. Raven and Scorpion grabbed 48 hours ago. He's using them as bait, knows you won't let them die. The trap was obvious, elegant in its simplicity. Force the survivors into the open, where superior numbers and resources could finish what Syria had started. But leaving their teammates to torture and execution wasn't an option that existed in Claw's operational DNA. Jane felt the familiar cold settling into her bones, the emotional shutdown that had let her function in situations where normal humans shattered. Eagle was waking up, and God help anyone who stood between her and her people. The bunker's weapons locker yielded its secrets to her touch, fingers remembering codes that officially didn't exist. "I'm done running," she said, checking the action on a rifle that had no serial number. "Time to remind them why they feared us." Reed nodded, his own transformation from colonel to operator as swift as changing clothes. The war had found them despite their best efforts to avoid it. Now they would wage it on their terms. The base gala erupted into chaos when Jane entered through the service corridor, her mechanic's coveralls replaced by tactical black that made officers reach for weapons they weren't carrying. Carver's champagne glass shattered on marble as she crossed the ballroom in 7 strides, his smirk evaporating when her hand found his throat with surgical precision. "Your tattoo's a death sentence," he gasped, struggling against her grip that could have crushed his windpipe but held just short of permanent damage. Security rushed forward, then froze as Reed's voice boomed across the space, his full dress uniform lending authority to words that rewrote reality for 200 witnesses. "Stand down. This woman is a hero, not a traitor. She spent 5 years in hiding because men like Carver sold out operators who bled for this country. What's next for Jane?" Predict her move in the comments. The media storm that followed would shake Washington's foundations, Jane's story spreading across networks faster than classification stamps could contain it. Leaked documents showed Claw's existence, their missions, the systematic hunting of survivors by forces within their own government. Patriots rallied behind operators abandoned by bureaucrats who'd ordered their deaths, while critics condemned the unit's methods as war crimes wrapped in flags. Jane became simultaneously hero and villain, her tattooed image splashed across screens as the face of shadow wars most Americans never knew existed. Congressional hearings demanded answers that no one in power wanted to give, the truth more damaging than any enemy's propaganda. Viper's arrival at the extraction point brought revelations that shattered what remained of Jane's world. His hands shook as he handed her an encrypted drive, its contents promising coordinates for the broker's next strike against Raven and Scorpion. But the secondary files made her step back. weapon half raised as betrayal carved fresh wounds over old scars. "Jane, please." Viper's voice broke like glass on concrete. They had Emma, my little girl, 13 years old, taken from her school in broad daylight. His eyes, once steady enough to hack Pentagon mainframes, now swam with tears that cut channels through tactical face paint. "They sent me videos, Jane, what they were doing to her. I could hear her screaming for me." "You gave them Syria." Jane's voice came out flat, emotionless, Eagle's coldness protecting what remained of her humanity. "Ghost died choking on his own blood because of you. Hammer never made it home to see his daughter's recital." Her finger found the trigger guard, muscle memory placing it exactly where training demanded. "Was she worth 6 of us, Viper? Was saving your blood worth spilling ours?" "Every night I see their faces," Viper continued, his confession pouring out like arterial blood. "But when I close my eyes, I see Emma hanging from a rope if I'd chosen differently. They gave me 6 hours to decide, 6 hours to weigh your lives against hers." He pulled out a photograph, hands trembling as he showed Jane a girl with his eyes and his smile. "She's 17 now, wants to be a teacher, doesn't know her father sold his soul and his family to keep her alive. Would you have chosen differently? If it was someone you loved?" Jane's mind reeled as memories crashed together like vehicles in a pileup. Viper pulling her from burning wreckage in Chechnya, taking bullets meant for her. Teaching her encryption in a Budapest safe house while they waited for extraction, his patience infinite as her fingers learned to dance across keyboards like weapons. The operation in Malaysia where she'd carried him 6 miles through jungle with his femur shattered, refusing to leave him despite orders. Family, Reed had called them, and families could betray deeper than any enemy. The drive in her hand contained salvation and damnation, a chance to save their teammates built on the foundation of his treason. "Raven's with me," Jane said, surprising everyone including herself. The female operative had maintained deeper cover than anyone suspected, now positioned to provide support that might make the impossible merely suicidal. Their communication channels had stayed dormant for 5 years, but Claw's protocols ran deeper than paranoia. One message, properly coded, would activate assets across 3 continents who'd been waiting for Eagle to spread her wings again. The network wasn't dead, merely sleeping, and the broker had made the fatal mistake of thinking survivors were victims rather than weapons temporarily sheathed. Reed's final briefing laid out the board with military precision. The broker remained a shadow, but his operations required infrastructure that left traces for those who knew where to look. Shell companies registered in Delaware, private military contractors recruiting specific skill sets, safe houses purchased through cutouts that Viper's financial expertise could unravel. They had 48 hours before Raven and Scorpion died under interrogation designed to break operators trained to resist conventional torture. The mission parameters were clear: infiltrate, extract, and disappear before superior forces could respond. Classic Claw, except this time they were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating without official sanction or support. Jane's tattoo caught the light as she checked her equipment one final time, the eagle seeming to flex its wings in anticipation. She'd hidden from this moment for 5 years, built a life of grease and anonymity that had crumbled the moment Carver spoke her true name. Now she stood on the precipice of war against enemies who wore her country's uniform, allied with a traitor whose betrayal had saved his daughter, hunting a ghost who turned death into profit. The mission that had begun in a maintenance bay would end in blood, but whose blood remained an open question. "Sometimes the past that seems buried is the key to survival," she murmured, Reed's nod confirming he understood the deeper meaning. The extraction began at midnight, Jane vanishing into darkness as naturally as breath. Behind her, Fort Bragg's lights blazed while sirens announced her escape. Military police chasing shadows she'd left for them to find. A helicopter's rotors beat overhead, searchlights painting geometric patterns across ground she'd already left behind. Reed's voice crackled through encrypted communications. "Eagle's back. Good luck." In the distance, an explosion flowered orange against the night, whether distraction or opening move in a larger game yet to be determined. The broker waited in shadows that Jane had called home for too long, unaware that his hunters had become the hunted.